topic of this video is the 10 antinomies of apocalyptic humanism. I made this video, a different version of this video almost exactly a year ago. It belongs to the final decan of the zodiacal year, the third decan of Sagittarius. So we're about to arrive at the winter solstice, which is tied to the nativity and Christmas, and so that's the beginning of the year. The solstice, the beginning of the pagan year. Christianity is the beginning of the Christian year. And so this final, this is kind of the final topic of 2022, but in a way it's kind of an epilogue, which is also an intro to the next round. And I'm just going to go through the 10 antinomies again, and just give my account of them as it stands today rather than a year ago. I'll start with just some general comments. Apocalyptic humanism is meant to name an attitude towards the future which synthesizes humanist secularism with pre-critical messianism. And it's tied to my view, which seems so obvious to me, but is not widely held, that a religious attitude towards the world does not need to be conservative or reactionary, and a futurist attitude towards the world does not need to be anti-humanist, and that humanist values like civil rights and so forth do not need to be anti-religious or anti-technology, anti-futurist. In my view, there are these sort of silos, these sort of political silos that are arguing at one another, and they're all missing the full picture that an accurate view is apocalyptic humanism, and that this view will always kind of be on the during this era will have to be on the margins, because it doesn't serve capital the way that the sort of false argument between the views that it transcends serves capital. That this is like the healthiest view that would be most helpful if it could be more widespread. And I can help it to be somewhat more widespread by articulating it and tying it to music and art and that kind of thing. But I do think that it kind of has to remain marginal, unfortunately. But and then it's comprised of antinomies, which they're instead of being, it could be comprised by articles of faith or values or statements or something, but that would be naive. An antinomy is more valuable than a statement or a value, because because it has a sort of a wider scope. It's closer to reality. So in other words, like our era is kind of its field of meaning is held in place by contradictions. Like we take a set of values for granted. There's sort of like the official Overton window, and then there are also other, a patchwork of other Overton windows, which see themselves as outside, but they're not outside at all. And these 10 antinomies are contradictions. They are topics that we haven't found the answer to these questions. We haven't found the solutions to these problems, and I can't. So I'm not capable of giving an answer to these questions or providing a solution to the problems, but I can correctly articulate what they are, and then endorse an attitude of questioning towards them, just to sort of have them presented for what they are, and in a way that you can sort of think of them all at the same time. Antinomy number 1 is about the relationship between the human mind and the divine mind. A classic religious view is that God's mind is inherently different from the human mind. We can kind of imagine it by analogy, that God must think in some sense that resembles our own thinking, but really it's our conception of it falls short, and it's just a difference in kind from our thinking, and maybe usually religious people don't imagine the human mind evolving, but even if they do, there would still be an absolute sort of cleft, a hiatus between God's mind and our mind. So the opposing view would be something more Hegelian, where the absolute doesn't have a fundamental existence, an essential existence, an inherent, a separate existence from humanity's potential, and that the human mind can evolve, and eventually it will simply become the divine mind. And clearly human history has caused the human mind to evolve in terms of building up theoretical knowledge about physics and mathematics and history and biology and human nature and so forth. And then in recent times, the actual substrate of the mind is evolving both through machine learning, which is really changing things, and then bioengineering is happening. That there's until recently, the development of the human mind maybe wasn't. It was more like better and better tools, and in some ways AI is just a tool. But thinking is changing, and so one can imagine that the human mind will really kind of just pass into becoming God's mind. Maybe not. So that's the first antinomy. The second antinomy is Felix Culpa, and in short, an important philosophical theme is that human beings, individually and collectively, experience terrible wounds and losses and suffering, and in many cases, that wound or loss or suffering can turn out to be a gift, sort of an opportunity to grow and actually attain self-realization that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So the question is, with all the suffering in the world, is humanity's suffering something that will ultimately be redeemed and be made to be worth it, or not? Is suffering is the class of suffering that ultimately is a gift a sort of restricted one? And it's it seems pretty obvious that most of the suffering in the world is not redeemed, and it's just sort of tragic. But one can imagine either way. The third antinomy is anthropogonical theogony, and this is the idea that God is being born through human history. So a lot of strains of occultism believe this, or present this belief. In Christianity, it is seen as a heresy. It's one of the sort of major opponents, because in Christianity, God is already perfect, and that God is happy. God is not lacking for anything or suffering, and His creation of the world was just a gift. It was a surplus. The Russian theologians call that Sophia. The love of the Trinity would have been totally fine, just continuing to love itself, but it decided to have a little more love and direct that love towards an outside. And it didn't have to happen, but it did. And there's something comforting about the idea that God is fine without us, but gave the world to us as a gift. It's a little darker to imagine that God, had a problem that He didn't know how to master, and so human history had to begin to unfold in order to solve that problem. So that's that antinomy. Christ as sacrificial lamb is number 4. So this gets into the question of basically faith versus knowledge as the path to salvation. Gnosticism views Christ as a bringer of knowledge. I would say Buddhism is like this too, where it's authentically religious, but the idea is that the Messiah brings a solution that's rational, or at least practical, even if it's not like logical in some kind of like intellectual sense. Whereas the Christian view is that faith in that salvation comes from just having a vivid felt sense that Christ really came and died and was resurrected, and that because of that all is forgiven, and that the kingdom of heaven will inevitably arrive. And it's not so practical or so intellectual. It's just there's this whole sort of there's a faculty of faith that if you really have faith, then God can work in your life through your faith. And this isn't, and a lot of this I should probably say, especially with this antinomy, but with the other ones, that when I talk about Gnosticism or heresy, most variants of modernism are variants of Gnosticism, and they don't have the aesthetics of occultism, but without realizing it, in anyone who's a capitalist or a communist or a humanist or whatever, they are working with an implicit theory of history that is ultimately theological. And it's really hard to make people realize that. Even if you believe in like the Big Bang, or think that the physical universe is prior to human history, or whatever, it's very hard for people, for whatever reason, to understand that they're still working within a theological narrative frame about humanity's destiny. And so, a really important move that I'm always presupposing having been made is that you identify those various views as variants of Gnosticism, as religious conceptions, and then that's step number one, and then you compare those religious conceptions to the Christian religious conception, which has historically always been sort of sharpening itself against heretical ones, and then once we get to the antinomy, it's usually the antinomy between the Christian view and the Gnostic view, which might present itself as secular. And I'm often tempted to endorse the Christian view over the Gnostic one, but I don't think it's that simple. I think that Christianity wouldn't have developed its dogmas without its opponent in Gnosticism. So really, they're in an assemblage together. Okay, what's next? Phenomenological polarity is number 5, and this is the thought that either that there is either an opposition that is metaphysically fundamental or not, and that can be described in different ways, like light versus dark, near versus far, alive versus dead, good versus bad. So one can imagine that polarity is an absolute, it's an engine of history, it sort of frames everything, or one can imagine that it is an artifact of human psychology, and that at a deeper level the world evolves according to different principles, either that we know or that we don't know. And so that this is really kind of, the topic is like phenomenology. Are there phenomenological absolutes or not? And the next Antinomy is secularism as divine kenosis. So one can imagine that there really is a higher world where God lives and the angels live, and that they're communicating with human beings through prayer and visions, and there's a battle between good and evil playing out on earth. And that even though we live in a secular time, that we're just mostly not seeing the battle as clearly as maybe people in the past did. Or, and this is again, Hegel is kind of the foundation of this view, that God, so divine kenosis, that God actually emptied himself out into the social field when modernity was born. And so there is no longer a transcendent world of God and the angels. Now, human love and equality and the thirst for knowledge and creative self-realization, that that all is the Holy Spirit, and basically that there is only a Holy Spirit, that the Father is gone, the Son is gone, and that human self-mastery, collective self-mastery, collective self-realization is continuing the progress of the church, but that the secular terms on which it is, according to which it is articulated, are correct. So God died on the cross. He really died. The theme of revaluation of all values is number 8, and that phrase I take from Nietzsche, and it's sort of in relation to his view of the Christianity of his day, which is similar to Blake's attitude towards the Christianity of his day, that basically that there's a God that had been good but has now become evil. So there's sort of an evil false God that reigns, and that true enlightened awareness and activity involves destroying the old temple and building a new one. So from the right-wing perspective, that old temple that needs to be destroyed would be like wokeness, the woke mind virus. From the left-wing perspective, wokeness is making progress, and the old temple is, it's just kind of patriarchy and white supremacy and capitalist exploitation and all that sort of thing. So these different views of sort of what the old God is. Something else encoded in this, or embedded in this antinomy, is the question of whether truth, goodness, beauty, and justice are eternal values, or whether the new regime of culture will have entirely new values that our minds aren't capable of really understanding yet. Antinomy number 9 is the question of whether enlightened awareness involves a kind of violence, or not really violence, but like a surging that challenges convention, that is kind of this like fiery kind of illumination, or whether it is comprised of a kind of renunciation and a sort of gentle, more rational, contemplative awareness. Finally, antinomy number 10 is reason or revelation. Basically, the sort of philosophical question of whether thought can and should hang together in a meaningful structure without remainder, or whether thought and even these 10 antinomies, there's this kind of modernist drive to be able to derive anything fundamental from other principles. Like, that was a big part of the sort of transcendental project of like Kant and especially Fichte, of sort of trying to show that transcendental categories must be what they are, that there must be a sort of a logic to things, and that's something that's taken for granted as an ideal in modern philosophy, whether avowed or not. But the reality is that it's no less rational to suppose that principles just happen to be what they are, and that the metaphysical world is really much messier and much more filled with like personhood and free agency than you might suppose. So those are the 10 antinomies, and yeah, so just closing out this zodiacal year, let's see what exactly to say. I think that these questions, it's valuable to have them in mind. Since, like, we all know that, like, since COVID, things have gotten weird, and are getting weirder and weirder, and that humanity seems to be on, the threshold of just, like, totally unbelievable transformation, and that's, kind of disturbing and scary, and like has exciting elements to it as well. And it's like what I kind of just want to drive home is that what I value fundamentally, as expressed through all of this, is that is there being, on the one hand, true value in prayer, faith, meditative breathing, faith that human fulfillment is possible, that even messianic fulfillment for society is possible, that the new era that's coming really could be one in which problems are solved in a really amazing way. And then on the other hand, to apocalyptic, and then on the other hand, that that the unfoldment of reason and the arts and wokeness. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's weird that I'm even using that term because it's a pejorative, but that uh, that the humanist paradigm in the way that it sort of refines the human spirit is also valuable and equally valuable. That there should be a mystical humanism, an apocalyptic humanism, and just as someone doing philosophy on the internet, I just can't believe how rare this view that I'm expressing is. Because it's what's true. It's true. And to anyone who has taken an interest in Christianity in the past year or two, you should still be a humanist and an individualist. And to anyone who, believes in human rights and egalitarianism, you should find God. Because both are true and both are needed. And it's almost like there's some ideological blockage that prevents, like, what I'm saying is so obviously true, but it's just so hard for people to see, because it's like, because there's this enslavement going on in the world, where people aren't able to fully tap into either their compassion or their self-realization, and then that makes us more passive and more vulnerable and easier to influence, and that's too bad. So